Hello, everyone. Welcome again to today's section of class where we are going to be exploring Dr. Najibade's work entitled "We Were on Top of the World: Fela Kuti's Coins and the Poetics of Space." In Ajibade's work, he uses interviews, which are more of ethnographic data that are collected in the cultural space, where several events actually took place during Fela Anikulapo's lifetime. And he also used several theories, especially those that are related to everyday life and performances, to make important argument on dynamic engagement with speciality. In his conceptualization of space, he also engages with how space connects with the idea of time and how that is also an important site of agency for women, not just women in ordinary everyday life, but how the role of women within the Kalakuta Republic connects with the kind of agency that women are able to create for themselves in ordinary everyday life. If you remember some of the materials that we've read earlier on Fela Anikulapo Kuti, his history and how Afrobeat began, and in fact the collapse of the Kalakuta Republic, we learned particularly about the Yabis as part of the series that Fela Anikulapo Kuti created after his return from the United States, and when he created the Africa 70 music band in Lagos. And so we are going to delve more into some documentary that gives us an insight into Fela's music and how he uses that as a weapon of not just political movement or but of bringing women into that side of politics, bringing in their voice and agency and constructing them in different ways depending on how critics of African literature or cultural studies are reading the presence, the activity, and the performativity of women within that space. And interestingly, in Dr. Majibade's work, we are able to also see how women are not just mere women in the site that is created within the Afrobeat music, but they are labeled queen. And to be queen, there is an intersection of how beauty is created and individualized by individual women's supervision of beauty. And so, beauty, it's not just something that is individualized, but becomes a part of the aesthetics of Afrobeats. And as a result of that, we now begin to challenge the idea of the public gaze of the women and, in fact, the role of Fela Anikulapo Kuti in constructing women as part of the Afrobeat genre and as part of the Afrobeat subculture. So we've looked at several Afrobeats and we've looked at Afrobeats and Afrobeats as an emerging um subgenre of Afrobeat. Whereas within the Kalakuta Republic and the works of Fela Anikulapo Kuti, it is not just Afrobeat, but all the kinds of culture that are created within that space, within the rhetorics that Fela Anikulapo Kuti pushes for, and the role of women in constructing those ideologies, and in fact, the epistemology of the culture of women in music, especially those that are driven by political underpinnings that challenges or that challenge the different kinds of oppression in West Africa, specifically in Nigeria during Fela Anikulapo Kuti's lifetime. And so, thinking about beauty and connecting that with the use of marijuana, right? Then it is really important to think about crossing that occurs not just as what happens within the space, but what the society has constructed as what is typical of the male gender versus what is typical of the female gender. So beauty then, it's not just aesthetics, it's also performance, and in fact embodying roles and constructing agency based on that roles. And therefore we think about that combination of beauty enhancement and marijuana, use of marijuana by these women as a way to diffuse, or in fact even reconstruct the label, as it moves from just general label of women and what it means to be queens of Afrobeat. And therefore agency is important as a way of thinking through the transformation that occurs through individual beauty reconfiguration, painting of face, and all of that. And that painting did not just occur as beauty, but as a way of entrance into a space that enhances the performances of these women, gives effectiveness to their work, and in fact, helps them to cross between the site of performance and ordinary everyday lives. And so, in some of the analysis that Dr. Ajibade did in his work, we see that there is that invention of exotic, queen makeup, right, as a form of visual creativity. And at the same time, we also see very, very deeply political themes that tantalizes the gaze of the population. And we now begin to question, would we say Fela Anikulapo Kuti tried to essentialize women, or uses them as a public gaze to gain the attention of people, several audiences, in order to push his narratives beyond just the Kalakuta publics? Because of all the performances of the women, the public enjoyed his performances. They want to come to it because it's not just the song, but also their gaze on the woman. And so, thinking of this about in relation to the ethos of the Afrobeat subculture, then we want to see how embodied politics is constructed through dance, and how that appeals not just to the publics, but as a way of pushing forth the rubrics of political issues that Afrobeat seem or usually addresses in Fela's work. And so dance, use of marijuana, the construction of beauty in ways that are unique to this queen constitutes this so-called idea of subculture, right? And therefore, Kalakuta then becomes a site of augmentation, amplification, and in fact, extension and even subversion, when juxtaposed against the notions of objectification that are attached to women's appearances at a shrine. For example, it became really questionable when Fela Anikulapo Kuti married 27 women who were teenagers at the same time. And then the question began to roll in terms of, are these children, kids, teens, whatever you want to call them, object of Fela's gaze, essentializing women, and in fact, even milking their appearances and beauty and the energy of these women for self gain? Or is it a way to challenge or to enact? You could think of it as challenging, but it could also be a way to enact the idea of polygamy and what legitimizes it, even within the culture of Africa. And so, in drawing on all of this, then we then begin to see the different categories of spaces that are occupied by this so-called queen. Ajibade identified two spaces. He called one the domestic space, which is directly linked to the Kalakuta Republic, and then the transient spaces. And these spaces are beyond just the Republic, but are also spaces that are outside of Kalakuta republics, that includes established institutions like the airport, the police station, and these spaces constitute not just institutions within the government or within a state or a nation state, but they are spaces of performance and mobility of what women stand for. And so, for example, the Yabi series that we see earlier on in our previous reading were enacted within this space as a way to speak back to power, as a way to address truth and to bring in the voice of women who generally within several cultures have been considered the voiceless. For example, Ajibade, in his analysis of some of the ethnographic works that he did, analyzed one of the queens of Afrobeat who paid right in the immigration office because the toilets were all filled up and there was no way for her to use the bathroom. And then, in removing her pants and also peeing right there and speaking back to the immigration office constitutes a way of pulling from the resources of the Yabi series as transcending just the space of Kalakuta into the publics. And that way, it is not just the whims of Fela and Nikolakpo political moves within that space of Kalakuta republics, but what women are capable of doing by themselves. They also embody this even in police station and the different kinds of rhetorics that are put together in such pushback that the Afrobeat queens engaged with within those spaces. For example, the kind of aesthetics that they carry on their faces bring the same effectiveness that they display before audiences in Kalakuta Republic to the police station, where they do not just see the self as just a self, but agent of transformation, agent that has the capability to insert their voice into ongoing, issues and social ills of the society. And so, despite the crossing that we see between the Kalakuta Republic and other spaces, we also see that space can also be gendered. And in fact, within that gendered space lies the politics of agency. Right. And so there is that organized belief within the society that women are objectified, and then there is that overlap between the ordinary everyday space and the aesthetic spaces. And so we see how all of this culminates into the rhetorics of power, who engages with this big space. And is it just Afrobeat that empowers women, or do women have what it takes to also create some sort of power, even if it is soft power for themselves? We see how this plays out amongst the wives of Fela and Kuti. For one of them, who is also named Fumilayo, had to create not just a collective interactions amongst the women, but an individualized representation of the self. So, in her work and in the way that she displays her own aesthetics, she tried to use different kinds of mimicry of who Fumilayo Ransom Kuti was during her lifetime, and in fact after her lifetime. And so what she did with this was to bring back a way of inserting the voice, the agency, the power, and the relevance of Ransom Kuti, Fumilayo Ransom Kuti, within that space of Kalakuta, and in fact within the political movement that was orchestrated by Afrobeat. And so, for her, creating an agency of the self, even within the collective, was a unique way of bringing a voice into the rhetorics, yet managing the slippage that comes with mockery when you mimic. And so, by the time Fumilayo and some Kuti passed, Fela Anikulapo Kuti bequeathed his mom's eyeglasses to Fumilayo, who is one of his queens. And then she continued to use this as a way of representing and also as a way of bringing back the memories and embodiment of Fumilayo Ransom Kuti within that same space. So when we think about women and the queens of Afrobeat and their role within Afrobeat, it is not just something that stayed only with Fela or that began with Fumilayo Ransom Kuti herself, who was a known activist in Nigeria and within several spaces, and in the way that she has challenged existing rhetorics of power and things that has really frustrated a lot of the masses in Nigeria at that time. And so, within the use of agency and how the Queen Fumilayo engages with power, she also moved on to actually even name her first child Olekoye, which is Fumilayo Ransom Kuti's middle name, as a way to reproduce that capacity that Fumilayo has, and also as a site of artistic creation, which acclaims not just performance but agency and primacy of the presence of the woman voice. And so overall we are going to be exploring all of these works and all the discussion around the queens of Afrobeat, what this means for space time, and the intersection of how this plays out in all of the transitions that we see in Kalakuta republics, and the role of women not just within the republic, but also outside of that confined space of Kalakuta. So I need you to go into the Canvas site, explore the reading and all the questions and discussion, and I look forward to reading your fantastic ideas and responses to those discussion.